and how we move forward on it, and of this dynamic world, how we go forward on it. Well, I thought of our speakers, it would be good to end with a farmer, and I indeed also first encountered Christopher at Dorchester Abbey talking about GM, and we have his write-up in our leaflet. Both been involved in agriculture in the UK and in Africa, with a degree from Oxford University in Agriculture on those great days when that was still possible, and very involved with the Church Mission Society for many, many decades, and also founder of Farm Crisis Network, and it's by his work with that and other areas of agriculture that Christopher was awarded an MBE 2 years ago. And so thank you for coming, and really look forward to your contribution. Thank you very much.
The great thing I got not to do is get myself tangled up in this. I once went to preach at a harvest festival in Leicester Cathedral. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Leicester Cathedral, but it has one of those sort of mountainous pulpits where it's just a sort of adventure to get up to and an even bigger adventure to get down. And I was kitted up like this with the verger, with the wires going up my sleeves and all sorts of clever things. And on my way down, I caught hold of it on something. The whole lot fell out. Went bang, 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 bang down the stairs. My wife, who couldn't see, thought it was me going bang, bang, bang. So if this ends up in an adventure, I hope you'll rescue it. I want to begin with a sort of slightly narrow focus at a sort of farm level, and imagining, as I did when this technology first appeared, imagine trying to sort of think what I might be thinking about it if it came our way, and if it had done it would have been in the form of oilseed rape, I think. Choosing a variety of a crop, you look for something reliable, likely to produce a healthy crop, and enable to help you to earn a living. It needs to be harvestable. You know, not all plants are harvestable. I once grew a variety of peas which provided me with interesting education how Maltesers are made. Each pea had its own particular shell and nut around it. It needs to be dryable or whatever other kind of process you have to do with it. It needs to be storable, and of course it needs to be saleable. If you start looking ahead a tiny bit, you start thinking, well, I don't want it to leave me with any residual problems. I don't want any rhizomes left behind that I can't, or other weeds or volunteers that I can't remove. I don't certainly want any toxins left in the soil, and I don't want a whole lot of unmanageable trash on the surface of the ground. And then I also don't want it to be too costly to grow, or it won't help me to earn a living. It will have the opposite effect. And, you know, up to that point, what difference will it make if it was GM or not? Now, stepping back just a bit further and looking a little bit wider and thinking about the medium term of the farm and the ongoing life and so on and so forth, a few questions started to appear. I referred to the fact I didn't want any difficult volunteer plants left behind. Now, as I said, the only GM crop that could have come our way in those days was oilseed rape. Now, I began to think, hey, we get a whole lot of Roundup resistant oilseed rape plants around the farm. This is going to be no fun whatsoever. Never mind, I didn't even think at this stage, but I did subsequently. Never mind if they crossbred with other weed plants. So this was the point at which I decided that I wasn't interested in growing GM rape. Then, of course, I thought, well, what happens if the neighbours start growing it if it comes our way? and it seemed to me kind of destructive in a way that the company which had invented a comparatively safe, reliable and serviceable weed killer for use in moderate ways was actually destroying its usefulness by producing a whole lot of plants that resisted it. So I began to get a bit turned off the whole concept, but in the form that it was coming towards me, or might have done. I also referred to the fact that it needs to be affordable. Now, at this point, we think we've come to something nobody has mentioned yet, is the tragedies that have been going on in India with farmers committing suicide because they have invested in the whole technology package and it hasn't happened to deliver. Now, if 100 of us farmers invest in a technology package, either because we're unlucky, or because we make a mistake, or because the weather goes funny on our side of the hill or something, it will go wrong for some of us. But a technology which requires a non-savable seed as part of an input package is probably not an appropriate technology for very poor people. Now, in other ways, I've visited this problem in my experience in Nigeria. It is tempting to help people to get up and get into another phase by lending them something so they can acquire something to change things. But being lent something when you've got nothing is a very dangerous process, because if you've got nothing and there's anything that goes wrong, you cannot get out of the situation. If the lender is determined to have it back. So I think that's a kind of context issue. Then moving on, again with my sort of farmer's perspective on it, I said to myself, well, I don't know who originally invented Roundup, but did it? I can't actually think that when they did, they meant it to be spread again and again over vast areas of the Earth's surface. All this one weed killer being used repeatedly. Because it's not diversity and variety are vital principles of farming. If you doubt that, those of you who are old enough remember what happened to elm trees. And that happened because they were all grown by suckers, so they were genetically similar. I can remember in 1975 and 76, with whole rows of beautiful elms, every single one just died from end to end. Now, with a genetically diverse population of trees, I doubt it would have happened quite like that. And of course, the inevitable result of using this one weed killer, this one technology, this one variety of crop, time after time after time, is that those who are doing it have now got some extremely exciting Roundup-resistant weeds of slightly disturbing dimensions. And they've been going around the fields, pulling them out by hand, which is not a thing American farmers are accustomed to. I've done it for growing crops for seed, but so there's but in this respect, GM is no different from any other technology used in this sort of gross fashion. The same sort of thing will happen. So it's final question as a farmer that I suppose I would have asked myself if I got near that is a thing which has been referred to extensively already. Who might I have to deal with? And overmighty transnational corporations are a very, very serious blight on the whole agricultural and food scene. Now, it's a very strange thing to me that farmers in the UK have at length fully understood the danger of supermarkets, but they don't actually perceive exactly the same sorts of dangers in Monsanto, perhaps because they haven't been bitten yet. But this technology is lodged in a power structure which I personally, I don't trade with supermarkets and I don't want to trade with Monsanto. I have met Mr. Schmeiser, and that was a very extraordinary story, and I certainly don't want to be part of a thing like that. Now, stepping back from the whole thing a bit, there are two things that, yes, I would like to draw your attention to the report, the IASTAT report, which has been shadowed in this country by the Bennington report, which I think was completely unnecessary because the other one had already been written. Bennington was wanted because Monsanto and others had been bitterly disappointed. They had gone to the World Bank and said, let's have this great big exercise on global agricultural science and technology and its development, which was duly set up. It was actually the head of the technical process was a man called Bob, his name had gone from me. Watson, yeah, thank you, who came back to work for DEFRA afterwards. And the people who had the bright idea were bitterly disappointed when they discovered that the piece of work that had been done was far more thorough, far more widely consulted, far better authenticated, far more firmly put in the context of world agriculture than they had bargained for. And so they were very keen that we should have another one in the UK which could make glowing references about GM, and also, quite incredibly, tell us all it was very important to complete the Doha round. What Professor Bennington was supposed particularly to know about the Doha round, I haven't the faintest idea. I rather thought after that we would start hearing that the success of the Olympic Games was going to depend on completing the Doha round. But they didn't quite get set up. So, yes, that report is extremely important. It's very long, but there are summaries of it, and it does have a website. Wasn't easy to get the text summaries. This came from the United States. The other thing I would like to refer you to, which I think Martin can assure me is on the Agriculture and Theology Project website, is the writing of Professor John Hodges, who was at one time head of livestock breeding and everything, the Milk Marketing Board, went on to Professor of Genetics at, I think it was Toronto University, then worked for FAO and so on and so forth. And he has written a piece, part of which is about the change, which has again been referred to today, of the position of scientists within society and the changes in scientists' self-understanding, both of which, he says, have gone in very unhappy directions. He writes from a clearly Christian perspective. The other thing that he talks about is pleading with everybody to leave genetic manipulation of animals alone. At least until a vastly greater amount is understood about how the genomes of animals work and so on and so forth. And I would urge people that, particularly if you're a bit scientific, to read that paper.
Where is it?
On the Agriculture and Theology Project website.
And then the author is John Hodges.
Professor John Hodges. What I, just to sort of sum up, what I think this thing is it's not one issue. It's a tangle of issues in sort of concentric rings. There's the question of what about GM, as it were, per se. People have pointed to this a bit already today. What are the issues and problems there? And point to the fact that I think in animals they'd still be huge, in plants it may not be so. Then there's the question about GM in particular applications. Is it in a particular situation appropriate or beneficial? That we've been talking a bit about that Indian tragedy. Is it economically and socially and technically appropriate in a particular application? Is it on a small and varied scale, or on a scale of huge monoculture? Now, the question there is there something inherent? Let me give you an example. If you're making jumbo jets, you've got to be doing it on a big scale. We can't expect to have 200 firms around the world employing a couple of £1,000 people each making jumbo jets. I don't think making jumbo jets works that way. I might be wrong. But is there something inherent in the whole GM process, the expense of it, or the complication of it, or something, which means it is inevitably going to be in the lap of very powerful corporations? Or is that purely a fortuitous result of the imperial designs of the people who run Monsanto and some of the other companies? In the same way that there is absolutely no inherent reason why supermarkets should be global empires. There's absolutely nothing about retailing food that requires it to be part of a global empire. So I'm just not quite sure whether GM is inevitably part of an imperial structure, or whether it could actually be a normal technology swimming around among others. Even better, whether it could be controlled by gentlemanly or gentlewomanly, objective, independent scientists. And is it driven by an objective, wide vision, or is it driven by clever dickery? Those would be important matters. And finally, there's the question, this whole question of patenting business. Now, I can't see that the patenting, I mean, commercially and imperially, it's attractive to have the patenting process linked with the GM technology. It puts you in a very powerful position. But I can't see any reason why it is inherent in the technology and its use that this complete absurdity of patenting discoveries. I mean, nobody was ever allowed to patent the discovery of iron ore or copper or ore or any other material. Why should they be allowed to patent a gene? It's absolutely nonsensical, and the courts that did it departed from a basic principle of the whole idea of patents. And it is an iniquitous situation that genes in other people's plant pools can be sort of co-opted, patented, run away with. So there are these concentric layers of issues which don't necessarily all hang together. And I think this is one of the reasons why you often get the impression that people arguing about GM are talking past each other, because they're actually talking from different circles in the layer of concentric circles of issues. And that's something one needs to be sure about, which circle which ring one's standing in, and which ring the other person is standing in, and whether you actually need to be having an argument at all sometimes. So that's my three havens, and I haven't destroyed this thing, or this thing, or this thing, or anything else, so I've done well.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure there are one or two questions for Christopher, so do please stay. Anyone got any questions?
John wants to ask a question.
was wondering whether Christopher will be happy when the patent on oilseed rape GM runs out next year to join those many Canadian farmers who are very happy doing it and have found that it increases their yields and their profits quite considerably.
No, I haven't.
Apparently no downside.
There is a downside because they've got Roundup resistant weeds, rape plants, and rape plants that are resistant to 1 or 2 other chemicals that have been tried as well. So I wouldn't, you know, I said right at the beginning when I first started thinking about it, I wasn't in for that. It's you know, it'll be in the wheat, it'll be in the pastures, it'll be all over the shop, and I'm not interested in having that problem.
You asked about whether it was destined, as it were, to be a multinational type of
Technology.
I think there is certainly something in what is said about the parallels with the drug industry and the development of pharmaceuticals in the sense that these days with the amount of regulation, which I think we need, but it has the knock-on effect that it costs an awful lot of money to get a product through a regulatory system. And so there isn't maybe the scope for the small or medium enterprise in biotechnology, same way that companies are taking each other over. And the other thing that I think maybe could have been mentioned, hasn't been mentioned, is the influence of the World Trade Organization and its rules of globalization. Interestingly, the European Commission recently, over the last couple of years, having got fed up with having to take all the decisions and the sort of inertia, if you like, within Europe, said, okay, what we might try and do is to allow member states to use their own judgment about whether they wanted to grow these crops. And that would not be based just on science, that could be based on socio-economic or ethical grounds, whatever grounds really they had. And fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know what you would say, but the result has been that they've been unable to get the member states to agree to that. And I think the main reason is that they are concerned that even if the European Union says, yes, go ahead and make your own decisions, the World Trade Organization may be able to take legal action against individual member states for pursuing the line that they want to
Yes,
take.
the World Trade Organization is hung up on this very unfortunate principle that you cannot distinguish between like products on the basis of how they were produced. Now, I know all about this because I had a lot to do with organizations trying to fight for better environmental and human conditions to do with bananas. And of course it makes a huge amount of difference how the banana is produced. But you can't, within the World Trade System as policed by the WTO, that's unfair discrimination. And I can quite well see how individual European countries that were trying to say, we don't want GM because we can't have, it's not a thing where individual consumers can make a choice because once it's got somewhere, it's got everywhere, and we're clear our population don't want it. But in this fine world, the consumer's always right. That would still be unfair trade discrimination. So, yes, I see that very, 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 that potential very clearly.
Question over here.
It's a comment actually rather than a question. I had a similar debate in my research group last week about GM, and the case of the Indian farmers came up, and I just thought I would share one of the points that was made, which was that if you actually look at the data, the number of Indian farmers committing suicide, the number is far predates the introduction of GM crops to the country, which kind of suggests that GM isn't what's causing these farmers to take their lives in order because they are so trapped in their situations, but rather that the problem somehow predates it and GM isn't helping. It's just, I don't know what the reasons are, but I think it's really interesting.
I've recently seen 1 or 2 emails on this, and unfortunately I'm getting too old to remember exactly what was being said, but it wasn't quite that. The other thing, of course, is that the issue is nothing to do with the GM itself. Any other technology where you had to buy a whole package could cause exactly the same situation. And I mean, I've seen things that I was dealing with in Nigeria kind of break down because some people's debts were unrecoverable, and therefore you couldn't recover anybody's, if you see what I mean. And so it's a difficult way of trying to do things.
I think it probably shows the critical level of farming in a lot of the majority world, that there is just not the leeway with whichever sorts of crops that they're using. So thank you.
Just want to say, I spent an afternoon in the company of Percy Schmeiser and his wife and a couple of dozen other people. I would find it hard to imagine a sincerer, honester, and also gutsier person. He spent years of his life fighting that thing, and it was so unfair. So I don't mind hearing him put down in any way. Number 2, thank you, Mr. Jones, for saving some of this day for me, because he put some of the appalling list of downsides that are on GM. Otherwise, I really found it quite a disappointing day. There was just far too much cheerleading for GM, not really enough exposing what it really is.
Thank you. I'll say that's interesting because I was worried it was going to be too much the other way, so that's quite an interesting comment. It would be just actually interesting just to have a quick show of hands if we ask it, have we been too pro, have we been too anti, or have we been about right in the middle? Just have a show of hands who just a sort of perception, who feels it's been largely pro today as a side. So few. Who think it's been largely anti as a side? So people who've had that sense, and who feels it's been largely balanced as a point of view. Well, that's quite helpful because our aim was to have it balanced, but that doesn't always come out in the day itself. So that's quite an interesting point. Yes. I think this is fine.
Can I just go the other way and say, this problem we all have is, what do we believe? Because I understand there's a huge amount of resistance. The ragweed is something like, what is it, 10 foot high, and they can't...
Oh, sorry, resistance among weeds.
Sorry.
No, I thought you meant resistance among people. Yeah.
So now they say, well, that's no problem because we'll genetically modify it to use 2,4-D.
Yes. And then we go on to the next one. Yes. I mean, I think if it had come across as being like any other farming technology, if it was used too much, too intensively, and too generally, and so on, there would be resistance problems and so on, because it's normal life. But that's not the way it's been put across at all. It's been a sort of magic fix-all and miracle and blah blah stuff. And it's just part of ordinary life.